They thought he was just another blind old man on a bench, an easy target for cruel laughter and even spit. But when a photograph slipped, when a cane tapped a rhythm only veterans knew, the town discovered the truth. Colonel Robert Hale, a sniper with 117 confirmed kills, who carried silence heavier than metals. What happens when arrogance collides with deadly patience? And how far will respect echo when a community finally sees the man behind the glasses? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Main Street carried the kind of rhythm that belonged to small towns, slow, steady, predictable. Storefronts with faded awnings lined both sides of the square, their windows filled with hand-painted signs advertising hardware antiques and fresh pies cooling at the bakery. The church bell in the distance told the hour, not loud enough to disrupt conversation, but enough to remind everyone the time. On the corner, beneath the shade of a sycamore that had stood longer than most of the buildings, a wooden bench waited like part of the scenery. People passed it each day the way they passed lampposts and fire hydrants, noticed without being seen. The old man sat there as though he had been carved into the bench itself. His posture was straight, almost formal, and his cane rested against his right leg with the precision of a placed object rather than one simply leaned. Dark glasses covered his eyes, the kind with thick lenses that turned daylight into mirrors. His coat was plain and dark, despite the warmth of the season, and buttoned all the way to his throat. Hands weathered by age and work were folded loosely in his lap, the skin lined and ridged like with grain. He spoke to no one. He turned his head occasionally, not toward voices but toward sounds. An engine shifting gears, the sharp clap of a hammer from a construction site, a child's bicycle chain clicking over as it slowed. People wondered if he could tell who passed by simply by the sound of their steps. Shoes scuffing, heels tapping, sneakers squeaking on pavement. Each seemed to register with him, though he never said a word. The bench had belonged to the town for as long as anyone remembered, but in recent years it had come to feel like his. He occupied it almost daily from late morning until the shadows grew long across the square. Locals accepted his presence the way they accepted the post office clock being a minute slow, or the diner's neon sign flickering at dusk. He was there, unchanging, as if holding the street steady with his silence. Now and then someone would nod politely or say a greeting. Most of the time he would incline his head slightly, acknowledging without committing to conversation. Some mistook it for distance, but those who lingered long enough understood it was just his way. He belonged more to the quiet than to the noise of exchange. Children who had grown up seeing him on the bench knew him only as the man with the dark glasses, and parents offered no explanation beyond a quiet reminder to be respectful. The passing years had folded the town inward, storefronts changing hands, young people leaving for larger places. Yet the old man remained where he always had. His bench gave the illusion that nothing important could change as long as he occupied it. Even the pigeons seemed to recognize his claim, circling the square but never perching close. At the diner across the street, waitresses sometimes paused by the window to glance at him while refilling coffee cups. He gave them no reason to watch, and yet they did. Perhaps it was the stillness, the rare quality of a man who seemed untouchable by hurry. In a town where gossip carried faster than traffic, no one quite knew his full story. A few fragments floated. He had once worked with his hands. He had lived alone for years. His eyes had failed him long ago. No one asked further. He did not invite curiosity, and so the town learned to accept his presence without needing explanation. By noon, the square would hum with traffic and conversation, but the man would remain, shaded by the tree and framed by the movement of others. He seemed to belong more to the bench than to the town itself, as if the wooden slats beneath him had chosen him long ago and refused to let him go. In his silence, in the way his head tilted toward sounds rather than sights, the day moved around him. He was noticed but not seen, present but apart. The town carried on, and he sat, steady as stone. The corner of Main Street, where the hardware store's awning cast a crooked shade across the sidewalk, had become a hangout spot for 3 local boys. They were not out of school long enough to feel the weight of responsibility, yet old enough to be too restless for the quiet rhythm of a small town. Their sneakers slapped against the pavement as they shifted from one idle distraction to another, one balance on the edge of the curb, testing how long he could teeter before falling into the street. Another scrolled through his phone with the kind of intent focus that only came when he searched for the next laugh, the next short clip that might win approval from strangers. The third chewed at a straw he had carried out of the convenience store, spitting fragments of plastic onto the ground between laughs. They spoke in voices louder than necessary, as though volume itself might make their jokes funnier. The sound carried down the quiet street, disturbing the soft drone of the square. Their laughter rose in sudden bursts, sharp and echoing, bouncing against the brick facades and glass windows of shops that had heard the same rhythms for decades. From across the street, a mother pushing a stroller gave him a disapproving glance. But they did not notice. Attention was their currency, and they saved it only for one another, for the lens of phone, and for whatever target seemed easiest. The boy with the phone lifted it higher, adjusting the camera to capture the group. He filmed their jokes, their mock punches, their rehearsed antics, and already thought about how the clips might look set to music. Their small world was not the town but the screen, likes, shares, the fleeting possibility of recognition. Real people around them were background noise, props for entertainment, if they were unlucky enough to catch the boy's interest. It was then that one of them noticed a figure on the bench. The old man sat motionless, the sunlight striking the lenses of his dark glasses until they reflected the world around him like mirrors. His cane rested at an angle, tipped steady against the pavement, his hands folded without movement. To the boys, his stillness was not dignity but weakness. He was different, unmoving, silent, apparently unaware of the world passing him by. The boy with the straw nudged his friends, pointing at the man as if he had discovered a secret prize. The camera tilted, capturing the scene. The boy behind the lens muttered something about how the clip would go viral. The others laughed, the sharp kind of laughter that came from mischief rather than humor. They whispered plans, daring one another with the impatience of young men who feared looking timid in front of each other. Their eyes lingered on the man's still figure, testing the boundaries of what they could do and how far they might go. Across the street, the world carried on with its usual pace. The waitress in the diner refilled coffee cups. A man unloading boxes at the hardware store paused briefly to stretch his back. No one noticed yet that attention had shifted, that the quiet figure on the bench had become the center of something crueler than simple laughter. The boys edged closer, their sneakers scraping against the concrete, their whispers sharper now. The phone's lens caught everything. The tree's shadow, the cane, the folded hands, the way the town's background noise seemed to thin as their focus narrowed on the old man. The sound of their laughter carried farther now, filling the square with an edge that did not belong there. It was the sound of mockery dressed up as entertainment, the sound of youth mistaking cruelty for courage. The old man did not move. He sat as he always did, steady as if carved into bench, waiting without reaction. The boys grinned at one another, the phone already recording, the moment already chosen. The silence of the man was the opening they needed, and their laughter swelled in anticipation of what they thought would be their next triumph. The three boys lingered near the bench, their laughter thinning into whispers as they drew closer to the old man. His stillness unsettled them in ways they would never admit to each other, so they masked it with jokes and restless energy. The phone remained lifted, its glass eye recording the scene. The boy holding it grinned, already imagining the comments that would appear beneath the video, already hearing the bursts of laughter from classmates who would replay it again and again. For them, the moment was not about the man at all. It was about performance, about the temporary satisfaction of attention in a world where silence and patience felt like foreign languages. The old man remained where he was, upright and steady, the faint breeze shifting the loose strands of his hair. His glasses reflected the storefronts opposite him, a blank mirror that gave nothing away. His hands did not move, his face betrayed no reaction. He was simply there, as though rooted into the bench by decades of habit, beyond their reach, beyond their noise. The boys circled like restless dogs around a figure that offered no resistance, and it was this absence of acknowledgement that stoked their cruelty further. They needed a reaction to validate their mischief, and when none came, they decided to force one. One of the boys, the one chewing on his straw, stepped forward with a smirk. He leaned slightly, bent his head, and with sharp, deliberate motion, spit onto the old man's shoe. The wet mark landed on the worn leather with a faint sound that was louder in their ears than it should have been. The boy straightened, his grin wide, waiting for the moment to explode into chaos. His friends burst into laughter almost instantly, the kind of high, brittle laughter that masked unease. The phone captured everything: the smirk, the spit, the laughter, and the boy behind the camera laughed louder to prove he was in control of the moment. But the man did not move. His head remained still, tilted slightly as though he were listening to something beyond their voices. His hands did not tighten. His shoulders did not shift. The boys looked at each other in the gap that followed, their laughter faltering for half a second as the silence stretched longer than expected. Then, from beneath the stillness, came a single sound. The old man lifted his cane an inch and let it fall gently against the pavement. The tap was quiet, precise, and final. It echoed in the small space between them with a weight that none of them had anticipated. The laughter stumbled. For a moment, they were caught in the unfamiliar feeling of being answered without words, without anger, without even visible acknowledgement. The sound of the cane striking the ground was not loud, yet it carried something deeper than volume. It was measured like a signal, deliberate enough to strip away the casual cruelty of what they had just done. The old man's face did not change, and his glasses gave nothing away, but the single tap hung in the air like a line drawn in the sand. The boy with the straw forced another laugh, louder this time, trying to pull his friends back into the safety of mockery. The others followed, but their laughter felt thinner now, strained against the weight of that tap. The phone kept recording, but the boy behind it felt a knot in his stomach he couldn't explain. He held the lens steady, capturing the stillness of man, the stain on the shoe, and the echo that seemed to linger long after the cane had touched the ground. People passed by on the other side of the street, unaware of what had just taken place. But the square itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the pigeons stirred uneasily, lifting from the pavement in a brief flutter before settling again farther from the bench. The boys tried to regain their rhythm, but the silence of the man had unsettled them in ways they did not understand. The spit had landed, the laughter had come, yet it felt as though they were the ones who had been marked, not him. The old man did not need words to answer them. One tap was enough. The diner sat across from the bench, its wide front windows giving anyone inside a view of the square. It was a kind of place that had served the town for generations. Vinyl booths patched with tape, a counter polished by decades of elbows, and a bell over the door that never stopped ringing during the lunch rush. Inside, the air smelled of coffee grounds and frying bacon, and the walls carried a low hum of conversation, interrupted only by the clink of cutlery on plates. From the corner booth to the stools at the counter, everyone knew it was the one spot in town where you could see everything happening outside without stepping into the weather. At the far end of the counter, a waitress refilled a row of mugs, moving with the automatic rhythm that came from years of routine. She was young compared to some of the regulars, but old enough to have grown tired of small-town talk. Still, she kept her eyes on the street more than most. The bench across the way was always within her line of sight, and the man who sat there had become part of her silent watch. She never spoke to him directly, but she noted the way he sat so still, the way he seemed untouched by the noise and movement around him. He had a gravity to him, though no one in the diner ever said so aloud. When the boys appeared at the corner, she noticed them immediately. The energy around them was different, louder, restless, careless. They leaned into each other's shoulders, their laughter ricocheting off the glass like an intrusion. She set a pot of coffee back on the burner and folded her arms, watching them edge closer to the bench. The old man did not turn, did not shift, did not break his line of stillness. He sat as though their noise was just wind in the trees, nothing worth reacting to. But the waitress saw more in that silence than ignorance. She knew the difference between someone unaware and someone choosing not to respond. She caught the moment one boy leaned forward and spit, the quick jerk at his head, the gleam on the man's shoe that followed. Her breath caught, though no one else in the diner seemed to notice. The laughter that came after reached through the glass, brittle and sharp, and she pressed her lips together. Still, the man did not move. Only his cane lifted and tapped once, deliberate and calm. To anyone else it might have seemed like nothing at all, but she felt the sound in her chest. It was the kind of gesture that meant more than words. Her hand went automatically to the small notebook kept by the register. It was a diner's ledger, a habit as old as the place itself. Waitresses scribbled small notes between orders, who had come in, who had passed by, moments that didn't belong to receipts but still deserved record. She flipped it open and wrote a line without hesitation. Bench! Boys mocking, man still. Cane tapped once. She closed the book, slid it back into the counter, and picked up her pot again. To the customers waiting for their coffee, it was just another moment in a long day, but to her it felt heavier, worth preserving. Outside, the boys were still laughing, though the edge in their voices betrayed something unsettled. The old man remained unmoved, his glasses reflecting the square, his shoe marked but not wiped. She turned back to the counter, pouring refills without missing a beat, but her eyes lifted once more to the window. Some moments passed quietly into nothing. Others demanded to be remembered, even if only in the neat handwriting of a waitress who had seen enough to know that silence often carried more weight than sound. The sound of a cruiser rolling slowly down Main Street was as familiar to the town as the church bell or the clattered deliveries at the hardware store. Its low hum drifted across the square, tires crunching against the uneven edge of pavement where the road met the curb. The sheriff often made this loop during the quieter hours, his presence less about chasing crime than reminding the town that order still had a shape. He was a broad man, his uniform worn from long years in service, the brim of his hat tilted low to shield his eyes from the noon glare. When he saw the cluster of boys on the corner, their laughter sharper than it ought to be, he slowed. The cruiser pulled alongside the sidewalk, and the boys stiffened at once. Their bravado faltered under the sudden weight of authority. One shoved his phone into his pocket, though the lens had already captured what they wanted. Another shuffled his feet, grinding his sneaker against the curb as though to prove he wasn't nervous. The sheriff rolled his window down and leaned out with the patience of someone used to speaking quietly, but carrying enough presence that words rarely needed repeating. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. All right, that's enough, he said. Move along. Find something better to do than standing here, making trouble. The boys exchanged glances. One muttered that they weren't doing anything, his tone defensive but thin. The sheriff's gaze cut through the excuse with steady disapproval. He didn't press further. He simply repeated himself, slower this time, and the weight of the pause afterward made it clear that his patience had a limit. Reluctantly, the boys stepped back from the bench, their sneakers scuffing the pavement as they shifted down the sidewalk a few paces. They laughed again, though the sound was weaker now, carried more by the need to save face than genuine amusement. The old man on the bench had not moved throughout the exchange. His posture remained unchanged, hands folded, cane resting lightly against his leg. He had not turned toward the sheriff's voice nor toward the sound of the boys retreating. To anyone watching, it looked as if he hadn't noticed at all. The sheriff gave him a brief nod out of habit, though he knew the man couldn't see it. Then he tapped the edge of his hat, rolled the cruiser forward, and disappeared around the corner, leaving the square to its ordinary rhythm once more. As soon as the car turned out of sight, the boys leaned toward one another again, their voices dropping to a whisper that carried just enough to be heard across the still air. Worthless, one hissed, bitterness dripping from the word. Another snickered, repeating it, enjoying the cruelty of saying aloud what they had all been thinking. They thought the man's silence made him less, made him vulnerable. They thought that by spitting, mocking, and whispering behind his stillness, they had proven something about themselves. The third boy shook his head and gave a nervous laugh, but he didn't stop the others. Their cruelty grew bolder in the absence of authority. The old man did not react. His hands stayed folded, his face turned slightly toward the distant sound of the sheriff's engine fading into the hills. The cane did not tap this time. His stillness became a wall the boys could not breach, though they tried to chip at it with laughter and whispered insults. Passers-by glanced their way but hurried on, unwilling to get involved. The square resumed its ordinary hum, but beneath it lingered the faint echo of the sheriff's warning and the sharper sting of the boys' words. The man on the bench remained as he had been, a fixture carved into the rhythm of Main Street, letting silence answer what others mistook for weakness. The afternoon settled over the square with the kind of warmth that made people slow their steps, linger at storefronts, and pause for conversations that stretched longer than intended. The old man remained on his bench, the sycamore above him casting a patchwork of shifting shadows across his coat and cane. For hours he had sat without motion, listening more than anyone realized. Trucks shifting gears as they rolled past the courthouse, the faint creak of a sign swinging above the barbershop, the clipped footsteps of a woman hurrying to catch the post office before it closed. His silence was unbroken until, with a small shift, he reached to adjust the front of his coat. The movement was simple. A tug at a button, a fold smooth against the breeze. From an inside pocket, something slipped free. It fell without sound, landing face up against the worn boards beneath the bench. The man did not notice. His hand returned to his lap. His head tilted slightly as if following the rhythm of a car radio passing by. The object on the ground caught the light. Its edges curled and softened by age, the surface worn but not erased. It was a photograph, small enough to fit in a palm. Its colors faded to the muted tones of time. In the picture, a younger man stared directly at the camera. He wore camouflage fatigues, his posture straight and assured, a rifle cradled across his chest with the ease of someone to whom the weapon was no stranger. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set, his expression caught between youth and a kind of hardened knowledge. The background showed rough terrain, blurred outlines of trees and earth, the suggestion of a place far from the quiet Vermont square. A woman walking her dog was the first to see it. She paused, tugged gently at the leash as her terrier sniffed near the bench. Her eyes fell on the photograph, and for a moment she bent without thought, picking it up with the care one gives of fragile things. She brushed a thumb across the surface, straightening the bent corner. At first she thought it was a postcard. Then she saw the face. She glanced up at the old man, at the way the dark glasses hid his eyes, at the way he sat with the same straight posture as the soldier in the picture. A recognition stirred, though she could not place exactly. "Sir," she said softly, her voice uncertain, "you dropped this." The man turned his head slightly, not toward her face, but toward the sound. His hand reached forward slowly, steady despite the blindness that kept him from seeing what she held. She placed the photograph in his palm, and his fingers closed around it with a care that suggested familiarity. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and tucked it back into his coat. The woman hesitated, words forming that she did not speak. She wanted to ask who he was, where the picture had been taken, why he kept it close. Instead, she gave a faint smile that he could not see and murmured, "Take care," before walking on, the leash pulling her dog back into the rhythm of the street. But the moment did not vanish. Another passerby had seen the photograph glint in the light before it was returned. A man unloading crates at the grocery leaned against the doorframe, watching, his brow furrowed. Inside the diner, the waitress at the window caught just enough of the exchange to notice the picture, the rifle, the soldier's stance frozen in time. The sight planted questions that moved quietly among them. The boys on the corner, restless as ever, had noticed too. Their laughter faded for a beat as the image reached them. The soldier in the photograph was not the fragile figure they mocked, but someone younger, harder, carrying a weapon that spoke of a life different from the one they imagined. One whispered something under his breath, dismissive, trying to shake off the unease. Another nudged him, forcing a laugh to cover the silence that had fallen too suddenly. The old man settled again into stillness, the photograph secure once more in his coat. The town resumed its motion around him, but the knowledge of what had been seen lingered in the air like a question without an answer. Those who glimpsed the soldier's face in the faded image carried it with them, a detail added to the unspoken story of the man on the bench. And though he said nothing, his silence seemed deeper now, as if the photograph had spoken on his behalf. The bell over the diner door jingled again, letting in a gust of air that carried the dust of the street. The lunch crowd was thinning, but the booths were still half full, plates smeared with the last streaks of gravy, and cups ringed with the dark stains of repeated coffee refills. The waitress moved from table to table with her practiced efficiency, topping off mugs, sliding plates onto trays, offering the kind of polite small talk that kept the room humming without ever drawing too much attention to herself. Yet her eyes, whenever she had the chance, drifted back toward the window overlooking Main Street and the bench beneath the sycamore tree. She had seen the photograph slip from the old man's coat. She had seen the woman return it, the way his hand closed around it with familiarity that spoke of years. And though the street had swallowed the moment and carried on, she couldn't let it go. The image was burned into her memory. The younger soldier with a rifle, his expression caught between resolve and exhaustion. It explained nothing outright, yet it changed everything. Behind the counter sat the diner's ledger, tucked between a stack of order pads and a chipped mug holding dull pencils. It had been there for years, passed from one waitress to another, each making small notes between orders. Some were practical, supply shortages, complaints about the grill running slow, reminders about the pie recipe. Others were fragments of the town's life. Who stopped in after church, who had returned from college, who was missing from their usual spot at the counter. It was not official, but in its way it was more accurate than the town records. It captured not what people declared, but what people noticed. When the waitress returned from clearing a booth, she slid the ledger closer and flipped it open. The handwriting inside told stories in looping cursive, hurried scribbles, and blocky capitals. She found an empty space near the middle of the page and wrote a short line in her neat hand. Bench, blind man, photo. She didn't add details. She didn't need to. Anyone who read it later would know it meant something worth remembering. Two men at the counter were already whispering about what they had seen outside. One claimed he had caught a glimpse of the photograph, said it looked like army fatigues. Another muttered that he had heard the old man was some kind of veteran, but didn't know what branch. Their voices carried just enough for nearby tables to catch fragments, and soon the hum of conversation shifted. People asked if anyone knew his name, if anyone had spoken to him at length. Answers were scarce. The waitress poured another round of coffee, her ears tuned to the way the whispers spread. A young couple leaned closer to each other, the woman saying she had always thought the man's posture looked too sharp for someone his age. An older farmer rubbed his jaw and remarked that you could tell by the way he held his cane, like it was part of him rather than a tool. Each observation added to a portrait that no one had dared to paint aloud before. The ledger remained on the counter, its ink still drying. The note was small, just a handful of words, but in the silence that followed it carried the weight of discovery. The man outside had been more than just a fixture of the bench. He carried with him a story sealed in the faded lines of a photograph. The townsfolk did not know the details yet, but the air in the diner shifted. Respect began to settle into the spaces between their words, replacing the casual dismissiveness that had once surrounded him. The waitress closed the book, slid it back into its place, and returned to her work. But she kept glancing at the bench across the street, watching the old man sit as still as ever, the sycamore shadow moving across his coat. To anyone else, nothing had changed. To her, and to the whispers now curling to the diner like steam rising from mugs, everything had. The three boys had retreated to the far side of the square, their laughter still echoing but thinner now, like a fire burning through its last dry wood. The excitement of mocking the old man had dulled into something else, restlessness mixed with unease. They gathered near the corner of the hardware store, leaning against the brick wall in the shade, sneakers scraping at the loose grit along the sidewalk. The one with the phone pulled out again, his thumb already moving to replay the clip. He grinned at first, proud of the evidence they had captured, certain it would be their biggest hit, yet once uploaded. The others leaned over his shoulder, eager to relive the moment. The video showed exactly what they had seen earlier. The smirk, the spit, the laughter rising too loud for the quiet street. The lens caught the reflection of sunlight in the old man's glasses, the mark on his shoe, the stillness that followed. Then came the tap of the cane. In the recording, the sound was sharp, distinct, louder than they remembered. It echoed in the phone speaker, like a deliberate punctuation. The boys laughed again, though one of them shifted uncomfortably, muttering that the sound gave him chills. The boy with the phone only smirked, saying it would make the video go viral. The dramatic silence before the laugh. But as he replayed it again, his grin faltered. He paused the frame when the cane moved. Zooming in, he noticed something that hadn't caught his eye before. The man's hand, gripping the wood, wasn't loose or shaky the way old men usually held canes. It wasn't the lazy lean of someone using it only to steady himself. The grip was precise, every finger in place, knuckles set in a way that suggested not fragility, but discipline. Even the angle of the wrist was exact, as though trained into muscle memory long ago and never forgotten. It was the way soldiers held their rifles in parade rest. Firm without tension, control without hesitation. The boy stared at the image on the screen, his thumb hovering over the pause button. His friends grew impatient, telling him to play it again, to stop freezing on the boring part. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the still hand said more than the entire act of spitting. He played it once more, focusing only on the moment the cane lifted and dropped. It was too deliberate, too measured, like a signal rather than an accident. He muttered something about it being weird, and one of the others laughed, dismissing him. Yet the unease spread between them, even if none wanted to admit it. The boy with the straw scoffed, saying the old man was just some blind fool who didn't even know they were there. Still, his voice lacked conviction. He kicked at the wall, harder than necessary, as if the noise could drown out the thought that maybe the old man's silence wasn't ignorance. The third boy folded his arms and muttered that the grip didn't look normal, that his uncle who used a cane never held it like that. The words hung between them, unacknowledged, until the boy with the phone pocketed it again, muttering that they were imagining things. Yet as they loitered on the corner, the image clung to him. Each time he blinked, he saw the hand tightening around the cane, exact and unyielding, more like a weapon than a crutch. He tried to laugh it off, tried to rejoin their banner, but the unease had taken root. Across the square, the old man sat as still as ever, unmoving, silent, his cane upright by his side. The boy found himself glancing back at him again and again, as though expecting those mirrored glasses to tilt toward him, as though the man could see more than he let on. The video was supposed to be funny. Instead, it left him unsettled, carrying the weight of something he couldn't yet name. The pawn shop stood 2 blocks from the square, a narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered shoe repair shop. Its sign, once painted in bright red letters, had faded to dull pink under decades of weather. Inside, the air smelled of dust, metal, and wood polish, the scent of objects that had been handled, forgotten, and passed along more times than their owners could count. Shelves sagged beneath old tools, guitars with broken strings, tarnished jewelry, and the kind of watches that ticked too loudly when the shop was quiet. Behind the counter, under the yellow glow of a single bulb, the pawn shop owner moved slowly, polishing a stack of pocket knives more out of habit than necessity. His hair had turned completely white, and his back had bent with age, but his memory remained sharp. He had seen the old man on the bench more than once. In fact, years earlier, the man had walked into his shop, cane tapping carefully against the worn floorboards. The doorbell had rung, and the owner had looked up to see him standing there, dark glasses hiding his eyes, coat buttoned despite the warmth of the day. He carried a small box, nothing ornate, just a plain container that looked heavy in a way that wasn't physical. The man set it gently on the counter and asked in a quiet voice if the owner could tell him what was worth. The box had held medals, bronze and silver, a ribbon of blue and white, another red, white, and green. The owner had recognized them instantly, even before touching them. They weren't trinkets, and they weren't the kind of awards given lightly. He remembered lifting one, feeling its weight, reading the inscription that marked a life of service and danger. He told the man that medals like these carried value, but not the kind that could be measured in cash. Collectors might pay, yes, but to sell them would be to sever them from the history they represented. The blind man had nodded slightly, saying nothing for a long moment. His hands rested on the counter, fingers still and steady. Then, almost as if testing the thought, he asked what someone might pay if he truly wished to sell. The owner gave him a figure, modest compared to the true worth, because the truth was that medals meant little to buyers who wanted only trophies to display in glass cases. The man listened, then shook his head. He closed the box with deliberate care, lifted it against his chest, and said in a voice that carried both finality and weariness, "Not for sale." He had turned then, tapping his cane toward the door, and left without another word. The memory stayed with the pawn shop owner long after. He had dealt with thousands of objects, bought and sold countless things, but he rarely remembered the faces behind them. This one he did. He remembered the way the man had held the box, not like property, but like a piece of himself. He remembered the silence after he refused the offer, a silence that felt less like hesitation and more like respect. So when whispers reached the shop about the incident on the square, about the photograph and the boys mocking him, the pawn shop owner spoke quietly to a customer who asked. He said the man had medals, real ones, earned in places far from Vermont. He said he could have sold them but didn't, because some things were not meant to be given away, not meant to hang on someone else's wall. The customer nodded, eyes widening slightly, and the story began to ripple outward. By evening, the tale had passed through the diner, the barber's chair, and the grocery line. People began to look at the old man differently. Even if they still didn't know his name, they pictured the box, the medals, the refusal. And though the man himself sat in silence on his bench, his story moved through the town in whispers, shaping how others saw him. The building where the old man lived was a narrow, aging structure on the edge of town, its brick walls darkened by decades of rain and soot. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish and dust, with carpet worn thin in the center where footsteps had passed the same route for years. Most of the tenants kept their doors cracked open during summer, letting in air and conversation, but his door was always closed. Neighbors said they rarely heard a sound from within, not even the faint noise of a radio or television. His apartment seemed sealed from the rest of the world, a pocket of quiet tucked inside the hum of ordinary life. Those who had glimpsed it described it the same way. Spare, almost bare, as if he needed little and wanted even less. A small table in the corner, a single chair beside it, a narrow bed, sheets folded tight, the kind of precise corners that never lost their shape. The kitchen was tidy but hardly used, a few utensils stacked neatly, mugs turned upside down on a shelf. There were no photographs on the walls, no decorations to suggest memory or preference, only blank spaces and muted colors. It was a place that felt temporary, though he had lived there longer than most of the other tenants. Blackout curtains hung heavy across the windows, drawn day and night. The neighbors said that even when sunlight poured into the hall, not a sliver escaped the edges of his apartment door. He seemed to prefer the dark, or at least the absence of light. Children who passed by whispered about it, calling his unit the cave, though their voices lowered when they saw him walk past, cane tapping rhythmically along the floorboards. The landlord once remarked that he was the easiest tenant he'd ever had. Rent arrived on time, slipped quietly under the office door in neat envelopes. Maintenance requests were never made. He asked for nothing, disturbed no one, and left no trace of complaint. He came and went on a schedule that seemed his alone, not bound by work or errands, but by something unspoken. Neighbors sometimes caught him in the stairwell. He moved slowly, but with an odd certainty, as though every step had been mapped long before. He rarely exchanged words, offering only a nod in acknowledgement. Once, a woman from the second floor tried to strike up a conversation about the weather. He had paused politely, tilting his head toward her voice, but after a few quiet words he had moved on, leaving her with the impression that silence was his truest language. There were no visitors. No family climbing the stairs to knock on his door. No friend stopping by to share a meal or drink. Packages never arrived with his name, and no letters stuck from his mailbox. The emptiness around him was not one of neglect but of choice, as though he had carved out a space where nothing unnecessary could enter. In a building alive with televisions, radios, and children arguing in the halls, his apartment remained untouched by sound. Yet for all its sparseness, people spoke of it with a kind of quiet respect. They said it suited him. They said it matched the way he carried himself on the bench, still and composed, as if the world beyond his door was a distraction he no longer needed. Some wondered how he passed the hours inside. Did he sit in the dark, remembering places and faces long gone? Did he count the silence like others counted time? No one knew. They only knew that behind those blackout curtains, in that small empty apartment, he lived with nothing but quiet, a man apart from the noise of a world that seemed to have forgotten him. The barber shop sat at the corner of the square, its striped pole turning lazily in the window, the glass clouded by years of sun and cleaning rags. Inside, the smell of talc, shaving cream, and old leather mixed with a faint hum of the radio that rarely played louder than a murmur. The barber himself had been at that chair for decades, his hand steady even as his hair turned silver and his posture slowed. He had seen every kind of customer sit in that chair. Farmers with sunburned necks, businessmen with neatly pressed collars, boys squirming under their mothers' watchful eyes. But he remembered one visit more clearly than most, though years had passed since it happened. The man from the bench had come in one late afternoon, moving carefully through the doorway with his cane. The bell above the door chimed, and the barber looked up to see him standing there, dark glasses in place, head tilted slightly as if listening for the sound of footsteps guiding him to the chair. There had been no small talk, no hesitation, only a single request spoken in a voice that was low but exact. He had asked for a regulation cut. The barber had paused for a moment, surprised at the phrasing. It wasn't how people usually ordered a trim. Most asked for it just a little off the sides, or short enough to keep cool. But the way he said it, sharp-clipped, with no wasted word, told a story all its own. The barber guided him to the chair, careful with a cane, and draped the cape around his shoulders. The man sat upright, posture rigid, as though the barber's chair were no different from a drill formation. He didn't slump the way most didn't sink into the seat with the weariness of the day. He held himself as though even rest required discipline. The barber remembered how unusual that felt, how it made the shop go quiet around them. When the clippers buzzed to life, the man didn't flinch. His hands rested evenly on the armrests, fingers curled with precision, not twitching or fidgeting as most did. He had given no further instruction after that first phrase. The barber worked carefully, trimming the hair to the neat, short style he remembered from photographs of soldiers returning home. It was efficient, no flair or style, only the practical uniformity of service life. The man's head tilted slightly when the clippers shifted direction, not because he was uneasy, but because he seemed to anticipate the motion. His speech, when he did speak, carried the same clip precision. A brief thank you when the cape was fastened, a short comment about the cost. Words cut down to their barest shape. The barber found himself adjusting his own tone, mirroring that spareness, speaking less, listening more. The haircut had ended in silence, the man rising with steady movements, folding a bill into the barber's hand before tapping his cane toward the door. Years later, the barber still recalled the weight of that request. Regulation cut. It wasn't something a man asked for unless it had been drilled into him, unless it was part of a life that required exactness in every detail. He had cut countless heads of hair, but that visit stood out because it was more than grooming. It was a glimpse of discipline that never left a man, even when his sight had. So when people in town whispered about the photograph and the medals, the barber only nodded. He said he wasn't surprised. He said he could tell by the way the man spoke, by the way he sat in the chair. Some habits belonged to soldiers long after the war was done, and some requests carried more history than the words themselves revealed. The sheriff's office sat a block from the square, a brick building with paint peeling from the trim, and a flag that snapped in the breeze above the doorway. Inside, the air carried the smell of old paper, coffee left too long on a burner, and the faint tang of gun oil. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers sagging with the weight of years. The sheriff moved among them with the slow patience of a man who knew the value of records, of names written in ink that outlasted memory. He had heard the whispers circulating since the photograph appeared on Main Street, whispers that made people lower their voices when speaking of the man on the bench. He decided it was time to look for answers. The cabinet he opened creaked in protest, its drawer filled with personnel files, service records, and notes dating back further than most cared to read. He thumbed through manila folders, the edges softened by years of handling. Each file carried a story: enlistments, deployments, commendations, sometimes a blunt truth of discharge papers. He paused often, scanning the names, searching for thread that tied the quiet figure on the bench to the soldier frozen in that old photograph. It was near the back, buried among the older files, that he found it. The name was written in careful block letters across the tab. Hale, Robert J. He slid the file free and set it on the desk, the weight of it heavier than expected. The folder opened to reveal a service record unlike most he had seen. Colonel, retired. The list of commendations filled page after page. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. Each award bore dates and citations, locations spread across decades and continents. He traced the lines of his finger, noting Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. It was not a career, it was a lifetime. Beneath the medals and commendations was a summary of service. 117 confirmed sniper kills. The number was stark on the page, a statistic that carried more gravity than most would ever comprehend. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning beneath him. He had known soldiers, had buried friends who wore the uniform, but rarely had he seen a record that carried such weight. The file included a photograph, clipped to the corner. Younger, sharper features, eyes that looked directly into the lens with the kind of clarity that could pierce through distance. The same face, older now, sat across the street each day with a cane at his side and glasses over his eyes. The sheriff closed the folder slowly, as though even the act of shutting it demanded respect. He sat for a long while, the sound of the office hushed around him. Outside, the town carried on with its routines, unaware of the file now resting on his desk. He thought about the boys who had mocked the man, about their laughter that rang too loud in the square. They had called him worthless. The sheriff now knew the truth. Colonel Robert Hale had lived a life marked by discipline, sacrifice, and service that most could not imagine. When he returned the folder to its place, he did so carefully, sliding it back into the drawer with deliberate hands. The knowledge stayed with him, heavier than the paper it was written on. The town might see only a blind man on a bench, silent and still. But the sheriff now carried the certainty of his name, his rank, and the weight of a past that explained the unyielding stillness the man brought with him wherever he sat. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall stood on the far end of town, its brickwork plain, its windows shaded. The flag outside faded by weather but never taken down. Inside, the air carried a mix of cigarette smoke, clinging to old coats, the faint scent of polish on wooden floors, and the sharper tang of whiskey poured into short glasses. It was a place where stories were told in fragments, where silence often filled the gaps more fully than words. The walls bore photographs of men in uniform, some framed with care, others curling at the edges. A glass cabinet displayed medals donated by families who wanted their names remembered. In a corner, near the bar that served more coffee than liquor on weeknights, sat the ledger, bound in black leather. Its spine cracked from years of use. It contained not transactions of money, but of memory. The ledger had been opened after every meeting, notes scribbled in pen, some names marked, some numbers written with an unsteady hand. It was not official. It was not meant for the eyes of outsiders. But within those pages lay the records that the men of the hall considered sacred, the kind of truths only spoken among those who understood. One evening, as talk drifted around the room about the incident on the square, the ledger was brought up. Someone asked if the man on the bench had ever been listed, if his service had been noted. The bartender, an old Marine with a limp that slowed his every step, pulled the book from its shelf and set it on the counter. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a section written in red ink. The room quieted as he read the name aloud. Asterisk, asterisk, Colonel Robert Hale. Asterisk, asterisk. The entry was sparse but heavy. It listed his years of service, the theaters of war where he had been deployed, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Next to each was a single number written in red, not in black like the rest. The final line bore the tally, asterisk, asterisk, 117 confirmed. Asterisk, asterisk, no flourish, no commentary, just a number, stark and undeniable. The men gathered leaned in, their voices dropping to whispers. They knew what those numbers meant. Each digit represented a life taken, but also lives spared, missions secured, men who returned home because one soldier, unseen, had done his job with terrifying precision. It was not a figure to boast of, nor one to dismiss. It was a truth carried by few and understood by fewer. No one raised a glass or laughed. The ledger closed softly, as if even paper demanded silence in the presence of such weight. The bartender slid it back into its place, his eyes downcast. One man muttered that he had heard of Hale's record years ago, but never knew it had been written down. Another said he had once seen him in memorial, standing apart from the crowd, cane in hand, his salute sharper than any man with sight could manage. The whispers spread, carried carefully through the hall. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others simply nodded, as though the truth only confirmed what they had always suspected about the man who sat so still on that bench. The number 117 echoed through their thoughts. It was not meant for gossip. It was not meant to leave the walls of the VFW, but it carried out all the same, whispered in grocery aisles, at church steps, at the counter of the diner. The town had always seen a blind man. Now, they began to understand the soldier who lived behind the silence. The church on the hill was quiet most days, its bell tower overlooking the town square and the rolling green that spread outward to the cemetery beyond. The deacon, an older man with hands roughened from years of tending both soil and scripture, remembered a particular morning when the pews were filled and the air heavy with grief. It had been the funeral of a young soldier, a local boy barely out of school who had enlisted and never returned. Families gathered in black. Neighbors lined the aisles, and the flag-draped coffin rested at the front of the church, its folds sharp, its colors deep against the wood. The deacon remembered the moment before the service began, when silence fell so thick that even the creak of the doors startled those inside. Through them stepped Robert Hale. His cane touched the floor in steady rhythm, each tap echoing like a metronome in the hush of the sanctuary. His glasses reflected the faint light streaming through stained glass, and his coat hung heavy despite the warmth of the day. He moved slowly, not uncertainly, but with deliberate measure, as if every step carried the weight of memory. He did not sit with the others. He did not seek comfort in the rows of family and friends. Instead, he walked alone down the aisle, past the bowed heads, until he stood at the front near the coffin. The deacon had watched from his place by the altar, struck by the way the old man seemed to bring with him a silence deeper than grief itself. The cane stopped, resting upright by his side. Then, with a motion that seemed almost impossible for someone who lived in darkness, Hale straightened his shoulders and lifted his hand in salute. It was flawless, the kind of salute drilled into soldiers from the first day of service, precise to the angle, held with unwavering discipline. It did not waver, did not falter. The blindness that claimed his eyes had no claim on his memory, on the years of practice that had etched the gesture into his very body. For a long moment, the church held its breath. Mothers clutched their children closer, veterans lowered their heads, and the family of the fallen soldier stared through tears at the figure who stood as if carved from stone. The deacon recalled how time seemed to bend then. The old man stood in silence, hand raised, and no one dared to interrupt. He did not speak, offered no word of comfort, no explanation for his presence. He only saluted, holding it longer than anyone else, until finally, with slow precision, he lowered his hand and turned away. Without another sound, he tapped his cane once against the stone floor and walked back up the aisle, his figure fading into the light spilling through the open doors. Afterward, people whispered. Some asked if he had known the boy personally, but no one could say. Others remarked that perhaps he saluted all who were lost, carrying the duty of remembering those who no longer could. The deacon himself believed it was something simpler and heavier, an instinct unbroken by time, to honor those who wore the same uniform. Years later, the memory remained sharp. The folded flag had been handed to the boy's mother at the graveside, her trembling hands clutching it to her chest. Yet in the deacon's mind, what lingered was the image of the blind man, standing alone in a church full of mourners, saluting with a precision that belonged not to sight, but to discipline and devotion. It was a reminder that service did not end when the uniform was folded away. For some, it lived on in silence, in gestures, in the unyielding posture of a man who carried more than he ever said. The widow lived in a modest house at the edge of town, where the paint peeled from the siding and the garden had gone wild with weeds. She was not old then, though grief had aged her quickly. Her son had been only 22 when the news came, the kind of news delivered in crisp uniforms and careful words that never softened the blow. The town turned out for his funeral, flags lining the streets, hymns sung in voices that trembled with sorrow. But it was not the service or the speeches that remained carved in her memory. It was the moment afterward, when the world expected her to accept what could never be accepted. At the graveside, under a sky heavy with clouds, the casket was lowered, and the honor guard folded the flag with exacting precision, each crease sharp, each motion practiced until it seemed mechanical. When it was done, the flag rested in their hands, a triangle of red, white, and blue, ready to be passed to her as the last tangible symbol of her son's service. She had braced herself for words, formal, rehearsed, telling her that the nation thanked her for her sacrifice. But instead, they stepped back and she saw him. Robert Hale was not part of the official detail. He stood apart, cane in hand, glasses hiding his eyes. She had noticed him earlier, standing alone at the back of the crowd, posture so straight it seemed impossible for a man his age. Now he stepped forward, and the honor guard parted as though they knew him, as though they recognized a weight in his presence that required no introduction. He reached for the flag, his hand steady, fingers folding over the cloth with care that did not falter. He held it to his chest for a moment, head bowed slightly, and then he turned to her. He said nothing, not a single word. He placed the flag in her arms, his movement slow, deliberate, reverent. For a long moment their hands touched through the fabric, her trembling his unshakable. She looked up, searching for his eyes behind the dark lenses, but found only her reflection staring back. And still, no words came. None were needed. The silence he carried was heavier than any speech could have been. It told her he understood loss, that he carried it with him, that he had delivered flags like this before and would never grow numb to what they meant. When he released the cloth and stepped back, the space around her seemed to still. She clutched the flag, pressing it to her chest as if it might keep her son closer. He tapped his cane once against the ground, a sound small yet final, and turned away. He left the cemetery without fanfare, disappearing into the crowd, swallowed by the rows of headstones and the whisper of the wind through the trees. In the days that followed, neighbors visited. Casseroles arrived at her doorstep, and condolences filled her ears until they became a blur. But in the quiet of the night, when grief pressed hardest, it was his silence she remembered most. Not the words of officials, not the murmured prayers, but the way he had given her the flag without trying to explain the inexplicable. It was a kind of silence that told her she was not alone in her grief, that someone else bore the weight alongside her, even if he would never speak of it. Years later, when she saw him on the bench in the square, she still felt it. She never approached, never disturbed his solitude, but she would pass by with her groceries and slow her steps, letting her eyes rest on him for a moment. The cane, the glasses, the straightness of his shoulders. It was enough to remind her that day of the flag pressed into her hands, of the silence that had carried her through. To others, he was just a blind man on the bench. To her, he was the one who had given her the only comfort that had ever mattered. The weight of a folded flag delivered without words, but with all the meaning the world could hold. The square had grown busier in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low enough to cast long shadows across the benches and storefronts. The old man sat where he always did, cane resting at his side, shoulders upright, his posture as constant as the clock above the post office. He seemed unbothered by the movement around him, the cars rolling past, the chatter spilling from the diner windows, the footsteps of people hurrying home. To anyone watching, he was simply part of the scenery, still and quiet as the sycamore shading him. But for the three boys, the sight of him stirred something restless, something unfinished. They gathered again on the corner, their voices carrying in bursts of laughter that sounded forced, almost practiced. The boy with the phone had replayed the earlier video so many times that the image of the cane tapping against the pavement replayed in his head even without the screen. The others had teased him for lingering on it, yet they too felt the unease. Rather than admit it, they masked it with bravado, daring each other to push further. When they saw him seated in his usual spot, their whispers turned sharper. One muttered that the photograph seen earlier was staged, that anyone could put on a uniform and pose. Another scoffed, saying the man's blindness was convenient, probably fake, just another trick to draw sympathy from strangers. The third laughed too loudly, repeating the taunts, pretending the noise erased his unease. Together they approached, emboldened by each other's presence, driven by the need to prove their cruelty was courage. They stopped a few feet from the bench, circling as if they meant to corner him. Their sneakers scuffed the concrete, their laughter pitched high, their words designed to cut. "Hey, old man." One jeered, "You drop your fake medals again?" The others laughed, nudging each other, eyes darting toward the phone that was already lifted to record. Another leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Can you even see us, or do you just pretend so people feel sorry for you?" The man did not turn his head, did not shift his posture. His glasses caught the light, mirroring their shapes back at them. To the boys, his silence felt like weakness, and so they pressed harder. "Bet those medals aren't even real," one sneered. "Bet you bought them from a pawn shop and make up stories about being a soldier." A hush seemed to fall over the square, subtle but noticeable. Conversations from the diner windows softened. Footsteps slowed. The stillness of the man had drawn eyes before, but now the venom in the boys' voices drew attention, too. People passing by glanced toward the bench, then quickly away, unwilling to intervene, but unwilling to pretend they hadn't heard. Through it all, the man remained as he was. His cane rested lightly against his leg, his hands folded with the same deliberate calm as always. The boys' taunts filled the air, bouncing back against the storefronts, but he did not react. His silence deepened, and though they didn't admit it, the weight of it pressed against them. The phone recorded every second, but the boy holding it found his hand growing slick with sweat, his laughter thinning even as he tried to keep it alive. The old man finally moved, but only slightly. His hand shifted on the cane, not to rise, not to strike, but to rest more firmly against it. The motion was small, yet it stilled the laughter for a fraction of a second. The precision of the grip, the certainty in the way his fingers curled around the wood, unsettled him again, though none dared admit it aloud. They covered the pause with another round of jeers, louder this time, but inside, each carried the same thought. If his silence meant nothing, why did it feel so heavy? The square carried on, but the balance of the afternoon had changed. The boys tried to laugh as though they were in control, yet the weight of his stillness clung to them, sharper than any insult they had thrown. The boys' laughter was still hanging in the air when the old man's hand moved. It wasn't sudden, nor was it hurried. His fingers slid with the same exactness they always had, curling more firmly around the cane as though preparing for something practiced long ago. For a moment, the street seemed to pause. The pigeons shifted on the roofline. The chatter from the diner windows softened, and even the boys fell into an uneasy silence as his arm lifted. The cane rose a few inches, steady despite his age, before lowering again. This time it did not strike once. It tapped twice in quick succession, paused, then tapped again in a rhythm so deliberate it rang different from anything they had heard before. To the boys, it meant nothing. They laughed nervously, nudging each other, saying he was just tapping nonsense to look dramatic. But to a handful of ears scattered across the square, the sound landed with the force of recognition. At a table outside the diner, a gray-haired man stopped mid-sip of his coffee. His hand froze on the cup, eyes narrowing as he tilted his head toward the sound. On the sidewalk, a veteran in a ball cap embroidered with faded unit insignia slowed his steps, his brow tightening as he counted the beats. Inside the barber shop, where the door had been left open to the summer air, the old barber set down his scissors, his mind reaching back through decades of barracks floors and training fields where such rhythms were drilled until they became second nature. The taps were not random. They carried precision, spacing measured with a soldier's discipline. They echoed patterns that veterans remember from nights on watch, from whispered codes exchanged across distances, from the unspoken language of those who had lived under fire. It was not loud, yet it traveled with weight, each beat distinct against the quiet square. The veterans who heard it did not speak immediately. They looked at one another first, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an understanding that needed no explanation. The boys continued to jeer, their voices louder now, covering their unease with bravado. One mocked the rhythm, clapping his hands in uneven imitation, drawing laughter from his friends. But even as they laughed, their eyes flickered to the man's hand, uneasy at how steady it remained. The cane did not shake with age. It rested in his grip, like a tool honed for purpose, each tap intentional, each pause deliberate. The man himself sat as still as always, his head tilted slightly as though listening not to the boys but to the faint responses his taps had stirred in the square. The veteran with the ball cap moved closer, his step slow, his face drawn tight with memory. He did not interrupt, but his presence carried weight. He recognized what the boys could not. This was not the random gesture of an old blind man. It was the echo of training that never left, of signals carried in silence, of discipline written into the body long after the wars were over. The rhythm faded, The final tap landing like a period at the end of the sentence. The boys laughed again, though it sounded thinner, more hollow. The old man lowered the cane back to its place by his leg and folded his hands once more, as though nothing had happened. But the square had changed. Those who recognized the pattern would not forget it. They whispered quietly among themselves, their voices carrying to the edges of the street. The boys' cruelty had meant something they could not explain. And though they pretended it was meaningless, the weight of the rhythm clung to them like a shadow. For the rest of the afternoon, the veterans kept watch more closely, their eyes drifting toward the bench, their conversations quieter. The man had spoken in a language not meant for all, but for those who knew, and those who knew felt it deep in their bones. The cane's tap was not weakness. It was signal. It was memory. It was proof. The diner was never completely quiet, even in the late afternoon lull. Plates clinked as they were stacked near the sink. Silverware rattled in a tub, and the faint hum of conversation drifted from a pair of farmers lingering over pie. The ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, stirring the air heavy with coffee and grease. At a booth near the window sat a man in his 30s, broad-shouldered, his haircut still neat in a way that marked him as military even years after leaving the service. He wore a plain t-shirt, sleeves stretched tight at his arms, a cap resting on the seat beside him. His coffee had been poured half an hour ago, and though he had lifted the cup more than once, it still sat nearly full, steam long since faded. He had heard the noise from across the street, the jeers of the boys, the laughter that carried too far for comfort. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just another petty disturbance, the kind of nonsense that always seemed to sprout in quiet towns when teenagers grew restless. But then came the tapping. His ears sharpened at once, the rhythm pulling him upright in the booth. 2 taps, a pause, another set. He froze, muscles tightening, memory flooding back faster than thought could keep up. The sound was faint through the glass, muffled by distance, yet it struck him with the clarity of something learned by repetition, under pressure. He had heard that cadence before, not in this town, not in the safety of daylight, but in deserts and ruined cities, in nights where silence was the only cover. They were sniper signals, field taps used to communicate when voices couldn't risk breaking the dark. Simple patterns, but precise, designed to be unmistakable to those trained to hear them. He sat back slowly, his chest tight, the laughter of the boys fading into background noise. The waitress passed by his table and asked if he wanted a refill. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the man across the street, seated on the bench as if nothing had happened, cane resting lightly in his grip. Only after a moment did he nod, voice low, distracted. She poured without comment, though she noticed he hadn't touched the first cup. The liquid inside had gone cold, but he didn't care. His focus was elsewhere, pinned to the steady posture of the figure in dark glasses. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, tried to reconcile the image before him with the memory that sound carried. The man looked fragile at first glance, old, blind, silent. Yet the tap told a different story, one the Marine recognized from the field. That rhythm wasn't random. It wasn't habit. It was a message, though not meant for him. It was proof of training, of discipline, of a past that the boys on the corner couldn't begin to understand. His thoughts drifted to instructors who had hammered those signals into his unit. Nights spent lying in the dirt, waiting for movement, rifle steady, hearts pounding as taps moved across the line like a whispered language. He remembered the way silence itself became heavy, alive, carrying meaning without words. Hearing it now, in the safety of a small Vermont town, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The boys kept laughing, tossing their taunts like stones against the stillness of the man on the bench. The Marine clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to get up, to walk across the street and tell them what they were playing with. But he stayed in his seat, watching, listening, letting the scene play out. His coffee cooled further, forgotten entirely. The sound of the cane's tap echoed in his memory, a signal from a battlefield that had never truly left him. When the boys finally drifted away, their laughter thinning into nothing, the man on the bench returned to stillness. To anyone else, it looked as if nothing had happened. But to the Marine, the truth was undeniable. He knew what he had heard. He knew what it meant. And as he sat in the booth with untouched coffee, he realized the silence surrounding that bench was not emptiness. It was discipline. It was history. It was a soldier's language, spoken long after the war had ended. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent behind the rooftops, the square had changed. The bench beneath the sycamore was no longer a forgotten corner of the town, but the center of an invisible circle. People moved differently around it now. Some slowed their steps as they passed, pretending to glance at shop windows or check the time, when in truth their eyes lingered on the old man with the cane. Others stopped outright, gathering near the diner's door or the barbershop window, pretending to chat idly while their attention remained fixed on the scene across the street. The three boys were still there, restless and loud, their voices carrying sharper than before. They laughed harder now, their jeers exaggerated, each one thrown like a stone to prove they weren't afraid. But the noise betrayed them. It was too forced, too eager. Even as they barked their insults about fake medals, about blindness that wasn't real, they glanced at the growing number of faces turned their way. The power of their laughter dimmed in the presence of witnesses. What once had seemed funny in the secrecy of their own group now sounded shrill, defensive. Inside the diner, the waitress stood at the window, drying the same glass over and over, her eyes never leaving the bench. The Marine from the booth leaned forward, elbows on the table, his untouched coffee cooling at his side. The barber had stepped into his doorway, scissors still in his apron pocket, watching silently. Even the pawn shop owner, closing up for the evening, paused to rest against his doorframe, his eyes narrowing as he followed the scene unfolding at the square's center. Whispers spread in low tones, threading through the crowd that had begun to form. People spoke of the photograph that had fallen from his coat, the soldier standing in fatigues, rifle in hand. Others recalled the story told at the VFW hall, the ledger entry marked in red ink, the number that no one could say aloud without lowering their voice, 117 confirmed. Some mentioned the medals a pawn shop owner swore he had once been offered but never sold, the ribbons folded carefully in a box carried close to the man's chest. Piece by piece, the shape of a life began to emerge, whispered into the square as the townsfolk connected fragments they had long ignored. The boys grew louder in response, their laughter ricocheting off the storefronts, trying to drown out what they sensed slipping away. The crowd silenced, the weight of its attention shifting from them to the man they mocked. Their jeers had lost their edge. They sounded less like jokes now, and more like desperate noise, the clamor of boys who had picked the wrong target and were too stubborn to admit it. Robert Hale remained unmoved. He sat as he always had, shoulders straight, hands folded, the cane resting against his leg. His dark glasses mirrored back the world, giving nothing away. He didn't turn his head toward the laughter, didn't flinch at the words hurled at him. His stillness was heavier than their noise, his silence sharper than any retort could have been. The crowd grew thicker as the evening deepened. A mother, holding her child by the hand, stopped at the edge of the square, her eyes fixed on Hale. An old man leaned on his own cane, murmuring to the woman beside him about a funeral years ago where the blind man had saluted without flaw. The whispers swelled until they formed a quiet hum, the sound of a community piecing together a truth that had lived in its midst all along. The boys still laughed, still tried to taunt, but their audience was no longer entertained. Their words fell flat against the silence of the man and the watchfulness of the town. The square had shifted, and they stood at the center of it, not as leaders of a joke, but as children who had not realized the weight of the man they mocked. Hale did not need to speak. The whispers spoke for him, carrying his past across the square, until even the boys, in their forced laughter, felt its reach. The sheriff stood at the edge of the square, his hat pulled low against the evening sun, hands resting heavy on his belt. From where he was, he could see the boys gathered near the bench, their laughter sharp enough to carry across the brickwork. He watched them jeer and point, the phone lifted once again to catch every second, their voices rising as though volume alone could prove their courage. But his eyes were not on the boys for long. They were fixed on the man they mocked, sitting as still as a monument beneath the sycamore, cane resting upright at his side. Robert Hale hadn't moved more than a fraction all afternoon. The sheriff knew that stillness too well. It wasn't the frailty of age or the resignation of a man beaten down by life. It was a discipline of someone who had spent decades teaching himself that patience was more powerful than noise, that waiting could be as deadly as action. The sheriff had seen that discipline written on paper, in the service records he had pulled from a filing cabinet that smelled of dust and time. Colonel Robert Hale, retired, decorated, a sniper with 117 confirmed kills. Numbers written without flourish. Just fact, the way the military recorded truths too heavy for casual conversation. The sheriff shifted his weight, boots grinding against the sidewalk. He thought of stepping in, of sending the boys scattering the way he had once before. But this time was different. The crowd had grown. Whispers carried like smoke from one doorway to another. People knew now. They knew the photograph wasn't staged, the medals weren't fake, the blindness wasn't weakness. They knew that the man sitting on that bench was someone whose silence carried the weight of a battlefield. To break that silence himself felt wrong, like stepping between lightning and the ground was meant to strike. His hand drifted to the radio, clipped at his shoulder, then fell away. What would he say anyway? That 3 boys were being cruel? That an old man sat too still while insults bounced off him? It was more than that. It was something he couldn't quite write into a report or explain over a call. This wasn't about disturbance or disorder. It was about the edge between ignorance and consequence, and he knew Robert Hale lived on that edge more comfortably than anyone alive. He remembered the ledger at the VFW, the red ink numbers spoken in hushed voices. He remembered the widow who once told him about the day Hale handed her a folded flag without words, his silence heavier than any officer's speech. He remembered the deacon's story of a funeral salute, so flawless it hushed a church filled with grief. These memories pressed on him now, shaping the way he looked at the scene before him. The boys saw a blind man. The crowd saw something else. And the sheriff knew better than to underestimate either the silence or the man who carried it. For a long moment, he stood rooted in place. The sun slid lower, shadows lengthened, and the boys' laughter grew more strained as it bounced against the quiet weight of the square. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. He knew Hale's reputation, not the gossip whispered at diners, not the speculation of boys with phones, but the truth written in official records and remembered by men who had served. Deadly patience. It was a phrase he had heard once from a veteran describing a sniper's gift, the ability to wait, still as stone, until the moment arrived. Watching Hale now, he understood what that meant. When the sheriff finally moved, it was only to adjust his hat against the sinking sun. His hand brushed the brim, his eyes never leaving the bench. He would not intervene. Not yet. He would let silence hold its place, let the boys' noise run against it until it collapsed under its own weight. And if the time came when action was needed, he knew, without question, that Robert Hale would not be the one caught unprepared. The journalist was not the kind of man most people noticed anymore. His hair had thinned to gray wisps, his glasses rolled low on the bridge of his nose, and his jacket bore the shine of years of use. He spent most of his afternoons at the library, shuffling through papers that no one else bothered with, chasing stories long since buried under new headlines. He was there the day the whispers about Robert Hale began to move through town, and though the townsfolk treated it as rumor, he recognized something in the silence surrounding the old man on the bench. He had been a war correspondent once, not embedded but close enough to know the weight certain names carried. When he heard 117 confirmed whispered at the VFW, he felt the same pull he had felt in jungles and deserts decades earlier. That night, under the hum of a desk lamp that cast more shadow than light, he opened a drawer in his home office and pulled out a folder he had nearly forgotten. It was filled with documents acquired through Freedom of Information requests filed years ago, requests most would have abandoned for lack of patience. The government had sent them piecemeal, with sections blacked out by thick bars of ink. He had read them once and put them aside, not knowing if the man described within was still alive. Now, with Hale's name moving through town like I half remembered him, he returned to the folder with hands that shook from something more than age. The first page carried a date, 1968. The jungles of Vietnam. A mission described in careful, clinical language. Enemy positions neutralized. Allied patrols spared ambush. At the bottom, a mark. Confirmation credited to Hale. R.J. The second page bore another date, 1971. a different province, the same cold detailed targets eliminated, the number adjusted upward in red pencil. Later pages shifted in time, the years crossing into the desert landscapes of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan. Each entry carried its own weight, its own confirmation. The places changed, the conflict shifted, but the march beside Hale's name grew steadily. The journalist read through them slowly, the way one listens to a litany, each word heavy with meaning. Dates, locations, operations with names like iron and stone. Some were short, only a line or two. Others stretched paragraphs, recounting nights of silence and mornings that broke with precision shots that altered the course of a battle. The red marks tallied beside them, steady as a metronome, until the final number matched the whispers, 117. He sat back in his chair, the papers spread across the desk like fragments of a story too vast to hold. It was not a tale of glory. The language was too sterile, the tone too detached. Yet between the lines, he could feel the pulse of it. The patience required to wait motionless for hours, the discipline to measure breath against trigger, the knowledge that every mark on the page was a life taken to save others. The next morning, he carried a copy of the folder to the diner, sliding into a booth by the window where the waitress knew better than to ask questions. He ordered coffee. He didn't touch and waited until the whispers reached his corner. When someone asked what he was reading, he didn't answer directly. He only tapped the folder, its pages heavy with blacked out lines and stamped seals, and said quietly, "It's all there. Missions, dates, places, confirmations." The word spread without him needing to show more. The existence of the file was enough. People understood that someone, somewhere, had kept a record, and that the man on the bench was not just a rumor, but a fact written into history. The journalist returned the folder to his drawer that night, but the story had already slipped loose, carried on the breath of those who passed it along. And still, Robert Hale sat silent under the sycamore, cane in hand, his past written in files others whispered over, but never heard from his own lips. The man who told the story had grown old in the same town where he had once been young and reckless. His hair was white now, his hands stiff with arthritis, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of someone who had spent long nights watching shadows for movement. He had been a spotter once, crouched low in the jungles of Vietnam. A pair of binoculars pressed his face while Robert Hale lay beside him, still as the roots beneath the earth. When asked about those years, he rarely spoke. But when the whispers of Hale's past began to circulate in the town square, he found himself sitting at a corner table in the VFW hall, clearing his throat and speaking into the quiet. He described the jungle first, the suffocating heat, the constant hum of insects, the way every leaf seemed to hide an enemy. "We had to move like ghosts," he said, his voice rough but steady. No sound, no slip, no second chance. His job had been to see, to calculate, to measure the distance and guide the shot. Hale's job had been to take it. Together, they became one machine, built on patience and trust. The old man recalled lying in mud for hours while leeches crawled over their boots, waiting for the right moment. Most men would break before the sun came up, he said, but Hale never shifted, never sighed. He could wait out the jungle itself. There was one phrase he remembered Hale repeating whenever they set up for a mission: one shot, one life spare for others. It wasn't written in any manual, not drilled into them in training. It was his own creed, spoken under his breath as he settled the rifle into the crook of his shoulder. The spotter explained what it meant. Each shot wasn't just about the target. It was about the patrol that would live because the ambush never came, the village that would sleep through the night because the threat was gone, the comrades who would make a home because someone had ended the danger before it reached them. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped on the table, and spoke of the nights that followed. Nights when the jungle swallowed all sound until the crack of a single shot split the silence, and then nothing but the faint rustle of leaves remained. "You never forget that sound," he said quietly. It wasn't loud. It was final. And every time, he lowered the rifle the same way, slow, careful, like he was handling something sacred. The old spotter paused, eyes wet but steady, and admitted he had never understood how Hale carried it all. 117 times, by the records. Each one, he believed, carried the weight of lives spared on the other side. He never bragged, never said a word about numbers. To him, It wasn't about kills. It was about keeping boys alive. That was what he told me, what he told himself. Around the table, the other veterans listened in silence. Some nodded, some looked down at their hands. The phrase lingered in the air like smoke. One shot, one life spare for others. It was simple, but it was heavy, and it explained more than any record or medal could. It explained the stillness of the blind man on the bench, the silence that never seemed empty, the weight that even time had not stripped away. The spotter's testimony was not written down, not recorded. It passed from ear to ear, carried out the hall and into the square, until the townsfolk who gathered near the sycamore knew the words too. They repeated them softly, unsure of their full meaning but certain of their truth. And still Hale sat, cane in hand, listening to the world around him. His creed carried on the voices of others, though he himself never spoke it aloud. The Veterans' Hall stood quiet at night, its flag lowered, its doors locked, the hum of the neon beer sign in the window dimmed to darkness. By day it was a place of stories half told and silences more eloquent than words. By night it became something else entirely, a keeper of relics that spoke more than the men who had once carried them. In the back room, where the carpet had thinned and the walls bore photographs yellow with time, stood a metal cabinet painted army green. Its edges were dented, its lock replaced twice, but its contents had never changed. Inside lay a rifle that had not fired in decades, a weapon preserved as carefully as a sacred object. The cabinet was opened rarely, usually only when a new generation of veterans wanted to know what was worth keeping behind steel. When the key turned in the lock, the hinges groaned and the smell of oil and old metal drifted out into the room. There, wrapped in cloth that had darkened with the years, rested the rifle. It was tagged with a card, handwriting faded but still legible. Hale R.J. retired, 1989. The tag was attached not for show, but for record, proof that this weapon had been preserved as part of the Hall's history. The rifle itself was simple in design. Its with stock worn smooth by hands that had carried it farther than most men traveled in a lifetime. The barrel, though cleaned and oiled, still held the invisible memory of nights in jungle rains, of deserts where sand scratched against the metal, of mountains where frost bit deep into steel. The scope was capped and locked in place, its lens once sharp enough to turn shadows into targets across impossible distances. For years it had been more than a tool. It had been an extension of Robert Hale himself, a companion in silence, a lifeline for the men who moved under his watch. Those who had seen the rifle never touched it carelessly. They spoke of it with the kind of restraint reserved for gravestones or folded flags. A few remembered watching Hale clean it, each movement methodical, almost ritualistic, as if keeping the rifle ready was part of keeping himself ready. He had brought it to Hall on the day he retired, carrying it in a plain case, his cane already at his side. Without speech or ceremony, he handed it over, wrote his name on the tag, and turned away. No one questioned him. No one asked why he left it behind. They understood. Some burdens were too heavy to carry home. Now it rested in silence, seen only by the few who had reason to unlock the cabinet. When the townsfolk whispered of his past, some pointed to the rifle as proof, not a rumor, not a story, but a fact of steel and was preserved behind glass and lock. The sight of it quieted even the most skeptical. They could imagine the old man's hands gripping it with the same precision. He still held his cane, the same steadiness that unnerved the boys who mocked him. The rifle had not fired in years, but its presence carried weight. It was not a museum piece, not polished for display. It was kept exactly as it had been left, untouched, its history locked inside the barrel, in the scratches along the stock, in the faint oil rubbed into its surface. To look at it was to understand that silence had once been paired with deadly reach, that patience had been measured in breath and distance. It reminded those who knew that Robert Hale was not simply a blind man on a bench. He was a soldier who had left his rifle behind, but never the discipline that defined him. And though it remained locked away, its shadow stretched across the square, carried into the whispers that circled around the man who had chosen silence over speech. The stories did not come all at once. They surfaced in fragments, carried by men who had served in different years, in different places, but who all remembered the same thing. Robert Hale did not waste words. In the field, He was not the kind of instructor who barked commands or filled the air with endless explanations. He spoke only when needed, and when he did, his words were short, exact, and final. The rest of the time, he let silence do the teaching. One younger veteran, now a father himself, recalled the first time he trained under Hale. It was a firing range, the air thick with cordite, young recruits restless and eager to prove themselves. They talked too much, their nerves spilling out in jokes and chatter. Hale stood behind them with his rifle slung over his shoulder, dark glasses already hiding eyes that had begun to fail. He didn't shout to quiet them. He simply stopped, folded his arms, and waited. One by one, the voices fell away until the only sound left was the wind sweeping over the range. Then, in that silence, Hale gave the only instruction they needed. Count your breath. The shot follows. The veteran swore that moment stayed with him longer than any lecture. Hale's silence was not emptiness. It was pressure, a weight that demanded focus. The absence of noise forced them to listen to their own pulse, to measure their movements, to realize how much control could be found in stillness. Another man remembered jungle training, where Hale had guided patrols through the thick canopy without saying more than a handful of words in hours. He didn't tell them when they were too loud, didn't scold them for snapping branches underfoot. He only tapped his finger against his lips or stopped and tilted his head, letting the recruits hear how their noise carried. By the time patrol ended, they had learned to move quieter, not because he told them to, but because the silence he demanded revealed their flaws. He didn't raise his voice, the man said. He didn't need to. Silence was his weapon, and we learned to respect it. Stories like these spread through the square as the townsfolk tried to piece together who Hale had been. Veterans who had once trained under him described the way he could stand beside a young soldier and make them doubt their own movements with nothing more than a pause, a glance, or the steady stillness of his presence. If he did speak, it was usually one sentence, trimmed of all excess. One shot, one life spared. Wait for the breath. Don't waste the silence. Words spoken once, then left to settle in the minds of those who listened. The townspeople began to see his silence differently. Where once they had assumed it was a mark of age or blindness or isolation, they now understood it as something chosen, something carried with intention. It was not weakness. It was discipline. The same discipline that had kept him still in jungles and deserts, that had trained younger men to measure every movement as though lives depended on it. Because they did. On the bench in the square, Robert Hale remained wordless, his cane resting against his leg. The boys still laughed at him, louder than before, but the crowd that gathered had begun to listen past their noise. They remembered the stories, remember how silence itself could be a teacher. And in the stillness he carried, they began to hear not emptiness, but authority, not the absence of words, but the presence of discipline. The ledger at the diner was never meant to be anything more than a record of the day's rhythm. It tracked orders, tallied bills, carried notes from waitresses who wanted to mark something they saw, but didn't want to say aloud. Over time, though, it became more than that. It became a book of witness, a quiet archive of moments the town chose not to forget. A spilled coffee here, a soldier's return there, a kindness written down so it wouldn't vanish when the day ended. Every line mattered to someone, though most customers never knew existed. It stayed behind the counter, its pages filled with names, shorthand, and small details only the staff understood. On the evening when the crowd thickened near the square and whispers grew too heavy to ignore, the waitress opened the ledger with her usual care. She had already filled it with brief notes of the week. The photograph that slipped from Hale's coat, the cane's tap, the boys' laughter. But now she paused, pen resting over the blank line, unsure how to capture what the square itself seemed to be saying. She looked out the window at the man on the bench, still motionless, his dark glasses catching the last light of day. Around him, people lingered, no longer just curious but protective in their silence. Even those who said nothing watched him differently, as if realizing all at once the depth of what he carried. She began to write slowly, the tip of the pen pressing hard into the paper, the ink sinking darker than usual. There were no numbers, no half-thought shorthand, only 4 words written clean and deliberate. Bench, respect owed. She underlined it once, thick enough to bleed through faintly to the next page. It wasn't a note about an order or a passing observation. It was a statement, final and unambiguous, for anyone who ever turned the pages later. When the cook came by to check the day's totals, his eyes fell on the line. He didn't ask for an explanation. He nodded once, then closed the book carefully, as though protecting the weight of those words. Later, another waitress flipped it open during a lull and saw the entry. She didn't laugh the way she might have at lighter scribbles in the past. She set her hand on the page for a moment, as if anchoring herself to it, then closed the ledger again without a word. The entry spread beyond the diner walls. Staff carried it into their conversations, telling others that the ledger had spoken for town. Those who hadn't seen it believed it anyway. They repeated the phrase as if it had always been there, carved into the bench itself. Respect owed. By the end of the week, it wasn't just a line in ink. It was a language the town began to use when they spoke of Robert Hale. The boys still mocked him, though their laughter rang thinner each day. But their noise now fell against a wall built from whispers, stories, and one written line that felt heavier than all their jeers combined. The ledger carried it, preserved it, and the town accepted it as truth. The blind man on the bench was no longer invisible. He was owed, and the book behind the counter, closed and resting by the register, bore the record in bold, where no one who opened it could miss the weight of what had been written down. By the following week, the square carried attention that no one needed to name. The bench beneath the sycamore was no longer just a seat for an old man with a cane. It had become a kind of marker, a place where silence and memory gathered, where people came not only to watch, but to measure themselves against what they knew now. The three boys still came, though less boldly, their laughter thinner, more defensive than triumphant. What they didn't expect was how quickly the town's attention had turned not only on them, but on the homes they came from. It began in the diner, where conversations flowed as easily as the coffee poured. The waitress who had written the line in the ledger spoke of it quietly to a pair of mothers seated at the counter. They listened, lips pressed tight, glancing out the window toward the bench. From there, the story moved to the barber shop, where men waiting for trim shook their heads and muttered about discipline, about how children should be raised. By evening, the whispers had spread to porches and grocery aisles, until the focus was no longer just the boys' cruelty, but the families that had let them believe such cruelty was strength. The parents began to feel it first in glances. At the hardware store, one father noticed neighbors looking his way, conversations pausing as he walked past. At the post office, a mother overheard two older women whispering her son's name, their tone heavy with disappointment. It wasn't long before the confrontation became direct. In church, a deacon stepped down from the pulpit after service and spoke plainly to one of the fathers. "That man on the bench saluted my friend's boy at his funeral. Your son spat on his shoe. You tell me what kind of house teaches that." The words landed harder than any sermon. Excuses came quickly at first. The parents said their boys were just restless, that it was harmless teasing, that they didn't know any better. But the town didn't accept it. Too many had heard the laughter with their own ears. Too many had seen the stillness it was thrown against. One by one, veterans began to step forward, not with anger but with quiet statements that stripped the excuses bare. "We buried our friends so you could raise your children free." One said, "Don't tell me they didn't know better. They knew. They chose." The pressure grew in small moments. At the grocery store, a clerk refused the bag items until a father admitted aloud what his son had done. At the diner, a mother found her order delayed while the cook reminded her, with nothing more than a glance toward the ledger, that the town remembered. These were not punishments written in law. They were judgments written in silence, in the way neighbors turned their eyes, in the way conversations hushed when the families entered a room. Eventually, apologies were demanded openly. A town meeting at the hall turned tense when a veteran stood, his cane tapping once on the floor for attention. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried. "You cannot undo what was done, but you can teach your boys what respect means. If you don't, we will." No one argued after that. The families faltered, caught between pride and shame. Some tried to insist that the old man himself had never spoken, that maybe the stories about him were exaggerated. But even as they said it, They saw the faces of the crowd, unyielding, certain. The stories were real. The silence was real. The respect was owed. In the end, excuses thinned out, replaced by uneasy acknowledgments and reluctant apologies spoken more for the town than for Hale. The boys themselves still carried defiance, but their families now knew that the weight of the square had shifted. What had begun as laughter on a corner had become a reckoning that stretched from the bench to every doorstep, demanding an answer from those who had once looked away. The sheriff chose the evening for his visit, when the light was low and the air over the square had settled into its usual rhythm of footsteps and the quiet murmur of townsfolk moving home. He had waited deliberately, not wanting to confront the boys in the middle of the crowd, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of an audience. This was not a lesson to be filmed or shouted over. It was a reckoning meant to land in silence. He found them near the convenience store, their bikes leaned against a wall, their voices carrying in bursts of nervous laughter that no longer sounded carefree. The moment his boots hit the pavement, their postures shifted. They tried to look casual, leaning back, smirking, but their eyes darted toward one another, measuring his approach. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his belt, his shadow stretching across the pavement toward them. He didn't waste time with questions. His voice was steady, firm, and clear enough to cut through their half-hearted grins. "You spit on a man who gave you the freedom to laugh." The words landed heavy. None of them spoke right away. One shifted his weight. Another glanced down at his shoes. The third tried to laugh but found the sound stuck in his throat. The sheriff let the silence stretch. He knew how to use it, just as Hale did. Then he stepped closer. "You think you're brave because you mock someone who didn't answer you back. But that man has done more for this town, for this country, than you'll ever understand unless you grow up fast." One of the boys tried to protest, muttering that they were just joking, that it wasn't serious. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Not serious?" His voice rose slightly, not in a shout, but in a way that carried the weight of authority. "He sat blind on a bench while you treated him like trash. That's not a joke. That's cowardice." The boys shrank at the word. They had been called many things in their young lives, but coward struck deeper than any insult they had expected. The sheriff leaned in just enough for them to see the steel in his eyes. "You spit on a soldier who stood watch while others slept, who waited in the dark so that children like you could wake up safe. 117 times. He pulled a trigger not for glory, not for himself, but so others could come home. And you," he paused, the silence stretching again, "you turned that into mockery." The words settled over them, heavier than the dusk around them. The sheriff straightened, his boots scuffing the pavement. "You owe him something you can't repay, but you will respect him. You will respect what he carried, what he still carries. Do you understand me?" The boys nodded, almost in unison, though their voices caught in their throats. None dared look at him directly. The sheriff studied them for a long moment, then tapped his finger once against his belt buckle, a gesture that echoed the deliberate rhythm they had all begun to recognize from the man on the bench. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the square. The boys stood in silence, their laughter gone, their bravado drained. Behind them, their bikes leaned like abandoned toys, and ahead of them, the weight of what they had done pressed down harder than any punishment the sheriff could have written on paper. The town had given them its judgment, but now they had heard it spoken directly, carved into words they could not shake. They had spat on a man who had once given them the freedom to laugh. The square was quieter than usual when the boys returned. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the brickwork, and the bench beneath the sycamore seemed to hold its own kind of gravity. They didn't approach in a pack the way they had before, their laughter spilling ahead of them. This time, their steps dragged, their voices kept low, their eyes scanning the ground rather than the windows where townsfolk might be watching. The sheriff's words still clung to them, sharper than any punishment they could have imagined. Robert Hale was already there, seated as he always was, shoulders straight, dark glasses catching the fading light. His cane rested against his leg, his hands folded in the same steady stillness that unnerved them before. He hadn't moved when they walked into the square, hadn't turned his head toward them, but they felt the weight of his presence before they were even near. The crowd wasn't as thick as on other days, but people lingered, an old man at the barber's doorway, A waitress leaning against a diner window, a veteran sipping coffee outside. Quiet witnesses who seemed to sense something was about to shift. The boys stopped a few feet away. None of them spoke at first. The one with the phone fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of notebook paper. It was creased and smudged from being handled too many times. The writing inside hurried, uncertain. He glanced at his friends, both of whom looked anywhere but at Hale. Then, with a shaky breath, he stepped forward. The bench loomed larger than it should have, as though the space around it belonged to the man who sat there. The boy placed the folded note carefully on the wood beside Hale, his hand lingering for a second longer than necessary. "We're sorry," he muttered, the words tumbling out too softly, almost lost in the stillness of the square. He didn't know if Hale could hear him, didn't know if he cared. But the note sat there now, folded like a flag too small to mean much, but heavy to the one who had written it. Hale did not turn his head. He did not reach for the paper. For a long moment, he seemed as unmovable as stone, silent, stretching wide and uncomfortable. The boys shifted, uneasy, waiting for something they couldn't name. Then, without warning, his right hand lifted the cane. Slowly, deliberately, he brought it down once against the pavement. The sound was sharp, resonant, carrying across the square like a bell. The boys froze. It wasn't a word, but it was an answer. They felt it as surely as if he had spoken aloud. The crowd seemed to feel it too. The waitress at the window straightened. The barber nodded once to himself. The veteran outside the diner lifted his cup in a silent gesture of respect. The boy who had placed the note stepped back, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. His friends avoided each other's eyes, but none of them laughed. The square held its breath until the old man lowered his cane again, folded his hands just as before, returning to the same stillness that had defined him since the beginning. The paper remained on the bench, untouched. Hale hadn't needed to read it. Words on a page meant little to a man who carried silence as discipline. The single tap was enough. It said what the town already knew. He had heard, he had judged, and for now, his silence was answer enough. The boys left slowly, not running, not laughing. Behind them, the bench remained as it always had, but something about it felt different now. The folded note sat in plain sight, but was the sound of the cane's tap that lingered in their ears long after they turned the corner. A sound that would not fade quickly, no matter how much they wished it might. Veterans Day arrived with the kind of clear, cold air that sharpened every sound in the square. The flag outside the post office snapped in the wind, and the church bell told the hour, its echoes carrying farther than usual in the stillness of morning. By noon, the townsfolk had gathered near the sycamore, where the bench that had become a quiet landmark stood as the center of attention. The Veterans Hall had loaned something for the occasion, a piece taken from its cabinet and placed under glass. The rifle Robert Hale had left behind on the day of his retirement. It rested on a sturdy wooden stand, the stock dark with years of use, the scope capped, the tag tied to it with faded string. Hale R.J. retired, 1989. There was no fanfare in its display, no speeches about glory. It stood as it had in the cabinet, preserved, silent, a relic of a past no one had dared embellish. Around it, people gathered in respectful quiet, the hum of the crowd subdued as though the rifle itself demanded it. Hale was there too, seated on his bench as always. He wore the same heavy coat, the same dark glasses, his cane resting upright at his side. He had not asked for the rifle to be brought, had not spoken a word about it. But when the veterans carried it out from the hall and placed it in the square, his posture straightened just slightly, his chin lifted toward the sound of boots on the pavement. He sat motionless, listening to the hush that fell as the display settled into place. The crowd included everyone. Families with children who clutched flags too large in their hands, old men wearing caps embroidered with unit insignias, women carrying photographs of fathers, brothers, and sons. Among them stood the three boys. They lingered near the back, their usual swagger absent. Their hands were buried deep in their pockets, their heads lowered, their eyes catching on a rifle but quickly dropping away. No one pushed them forward, no one demanded they stand closer. The weight of the day had already pressed them into silence. When the ceremony began, there were no long speeches. The deacon offered prayer, his voice steady, carrying across the square without effort. The sheriff read the names of the town's fallen, each one answered by the toll of the bell. Then came the rifle salute, not of gunfire, but of memory. The veterans stood in a line beside the display, saluting in turn, their movements slow, precise, exact. Each one lowered his hand, stepped back, and left the silence to deepen. Through it all, Hale did not rise. He did not speak. But as the final salute was given, he lifted his cane slightly, tapping it once against the pavement. The sound rang sharp, unmistakable, echoing to the square with a finality that seemed to seal the ceremony itself. Heads turned toward him, and for a moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath. It was not rehearsed, not expected, but it carried more weight than anything said aloud that day. The boys in the back felt it most of all. Their heads dipped lower, shoulders heavy. They didn't laugh, didn't whisper. They stood still, the rifle in its glass case before them, the old man on his bench beside it, and the memory of the cane's tap burning in their ears. They had mocked him once, spat on his shoe, called his medals fake. Now they stood among a town that understood, and the silence that surrounded Hale left no room for excuses. When the crowd began to disperse, the rifle remained in its case, and Hale stayed on his bench, unmoved. The boys slipped away quietly, unnoticed except the way their heads remained bowed as they walked. The rifle, the salute, the single tap of the cane, together they had reshaped the square, leaving behind a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like respect finally learned. The winter sun sat low over the rooftops, pale and thin, casting long shadows across the bricks of the square. The sycamore's branches were bare now, its leaves swept into corners where the wind nudged them along the gutters. The bench beneath it remained in its place, worn smooth by time and weather, the same bench where everything had begun. Robert Hale sat there once more, coat buttoned to his collar, cane resting upright against his leg, dark glasses turned toward the street as though he could see it all unfold. He was still, as he had always been, a figure that blended into the rhythm of the town until the silence around him reminded everyone he was not to be ignored. The square moved as usual. Children skipped across the pavement. Mothers tugged them gently toward the grocery. Men leaned against trucks and exchanged brief words about weather and work. Life carried on with its small, unremarkable details, but something beneath it had shifted. The laughter that once echoed sharp and careless near the bench had vanished. No one jeered, no one tested the old man's patience. People still looked, sometimes lingering longer than they meant to, but their glances carried weight rather than mockery. They did not stare, they acknowledged. Then they moved on, quieter for having passed him. The boys who had once spat on his shoe no longer haunted the square with restless bravado. They appeared sometimes, walking quickly, shoulders tucked in, their voices subdued. They never approached the bench, but when they passed it, their steps slowed, heads lowered, words died on their tongues. No one had told them to do so. The sheriff had spoken, the town had judged, but it was the silence of the man himself that lingered longest. They had learned it was not weakness. It was something greater, and it demanded respect even from those who once thought themselves fearless. At the diner, the ledger remained open behind the counter, its pages filled with the ordinary notations of coffee poured, pies served, and customers seen. But near the top of a new page, written in the same steady hand that had once recorded bench, respect owed, there was a different line. The waitress had written it after Veterans Day, after the rifle had been displayed, and the crowd had stood in reverence. She had pressed her pen harder than usual, the words bold, final, 117, known. Silence, greater, asterisk, asterisk, the cook had read it aloud once, quietly, then closed the book as if to seal the truth inside. Since then, no one had added commentary. The line stood on its own, as stark and immovable as the man it described. Hale himself remained unchanged. He did not acknowledge the whispers, did not turn toward the cautious greetings some now offered. His stillness was the same as it had been the first day the boys mocked him, the same as it had been decades earlier in jungles, deserts, and mountains where patience was life. The difference was not in him. It was in the town that moved around him, carrying the knowledge of who he was and what he had done, letting it settle into the fabric of their days without spectacle. The cane rested against his leg, his hands folded, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something beyond the square. He tapped it once now and then, not in anger, not in warning, but in rhythm with some private measure time only he kept. Each tap carried across the pavement, a reminder that silence was never empty, that it could hold more than words ever could. As dusk settled and the lamps flickered to life, the square returned to its ordinary pace. The old man remained on his bench, unmoving, while life flowed around him. No one laughed. No one jeered. The town had come to understand that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of discipline, memory, and weight. And so the story closed as it had begun, with Hale seated in stillness, the world passing by, and the ledger recording what words could not fully capture. 117. Known. Silence greater. Asterisk, asterisk.